My name is Al Fadi with Sira International. I'm a former Wahhabi Muslim from Saudi Arabia, and through Sira International, we're striving to create awareness about Islam, to inform and challenge the Church concerning outreach to Muslims, to equip the believers with effective evangelism and apologetic tools to advance the gospel among our Muslim neighbors. Now, today we are going to continue with our discussion, myself and Joel here in studio, about the comparison between the traditional location of Mount Sinai and the alternate location. However, the first focus is going to be on the possible location of the Red Sea crossing itself. Joel, thank you again for being here with us.
Good to be back.
So, you mentioned last time that we are going to visit the actual Red Sea crossing, if you wish, from a biblical standpoint, because that will open the gate towards why this alternate location possibly is the real one.
Right. Okay, so in looking at this map, as we began to discuss in the last episode, we've got essentially two branches of the Red Sea. You've got the western branch. It's over there toward Egypt and leads up to Cairo. And of course, in modern times, it's been dredged out to where you have the Suez Canal, right? Of course, one of the world's greatest shipping channels to sort of cut through that whole region. And then on the eastern side, you have the Gulf of Aqaba, also known as the Red Sea. Up at the top of it, on the northern tip, on the Israeli side, you've got Eilat, which is called, biblically speaking, that's Eloth. It's referred to as Eloth. Today it's Eilat. I call it the Florida of Israel. And then on the Jordanian side, you have Aqaba. Okay. Now, just below Aqaba, as soon as you get south of that, is Saudi Arabia. So that's the Jordanian line. North is Jordan, south is Saudi Arabia. So the question is, where did the miracle happen? Did it happen somewhere in the middle of the Gulf of Aqaba, the Red Sea, or did it happen over there in the Suez? Okay, so this requires a little bit, this was interesting, it requires a little bit of historical and biblical detective work. So you have a few different issues that have complicated and confused this over the years. One is the meaning of the Hebrew word suf. Okay, so the Bible says that the crossing took place through something called the Yam Suf.
That's right.
Yam is just sea. Suf, what does suf mean? Okay, so there's that whole question. And then there's also this other issue that comes in, which is the ancient understanding of the geography of the region. And so here's what's a really fascinating reality, is that you cannot find, if you go to the mid-1800s, as just recent as the early 1800s, you cannot find a map that actually includes the Sinai Peninsula.
Interesting.
So ancient geography, they didn't recognize that there was this massive peninsula. Every ancient map will essentially have Africa, and then it will have Arabia. Sometimes there's this very small nub in between, but they didn't seem to really grasp the size of this thing and the fact that there were these two branches. So sometimes these two branches almost in their minds and in maps get blended together. And it's as though they didn't realize there were two very distinct branches of the Red Sea. And then there's the issue of Yam Suf. So again, in the Hebrew Bible, the sea crossing took place through the Yam Suf. Later, in the 3rd century BC, when they started translating the Septuagint, this is the Greek translation
of the Old Testament.
Old Testament. They didn't know how to translate that, and so they changed it. Again, the word suf was translated essentially as red. Okay, now today scholars go, how did that happen? Where did that come from? And so again, this is really a complex series of factors that led into this. So as I mentioned in the last program, it was not until the 5th century AD, so you're talking 500 years after Jesus, that Emperor Justinian built St. Catherine's Monastery at the site of the traditional Mount Sinai.
Correct.
Okay, so again, how did that whole thing start? Some monks, which is kind of ironic, it's kind of funny. Some Christian monks left Egypt in the 4th century because they wanted to escape the corruption at their time of modern society. It had just gotten too corrupt. They said, we need to withdraw into the desert to pray. Okay, so this was the beginning of the Christian Eastern monastic desert fathers type of thing, right? And so they're out there in the desert, and they just sort of arbitrarily, for all intents and purposes, chose and declared this particular mountain down there in the Sinai Peninsula to be the real Mount Sinai because of its size. Okay? But again, there was no biblical evidence, no historical evidence, no archaeological evidence. Then, after 150 years, they kept getting killed by these marauding Ishmaelites, these just desert Bedouins, essentially. Emperor Justinian built St. Catherine's Monastery. Well, once you have the Roman emperor, for all intents and purposes, putting his stamp of approval, saying this is the real Mount Sinai, Christendom, from that time forward, accepted it. And all the attention of the Christian world was on this. So now you get up into the modern times, and scholars say, well, if Mount Sinai is in the Sinai Peninsula, then that means the sea crossing must have taken place over on the western side.
Makes sense, yeah.
And so they look at the word Suf, okay, the Sea of Suf, and they go, what does Suf mean? And what they've concluded is that it was it was a Hebrew word that was borrowed from the Egyptians, and it means reeds. It means the Sea of Reeds. Mm-hmm. So rather than an ocean, like as we picture in Cecil B. DeMille's, Exodus movie, walls of water and all this, they go, no, it actually took place through these marshes that were up there in Egypt. These were just, maybe a few feet deep, but the wind blew. It was kind of a supernatural,
right,
perfect timing type of thing. It was explainable through natural observations, this type of thing. But then when the winds receded, Pharaoh's armies got swept up and they drowned and this type of thing. Well, it's barely miraculous, to be honest with you. Okay, but again, they needed to somehow establish that the sea crossing took place over there because of this tradition that the Mount Sinai is there in the Sinai Peninsula. Now, here's the glaring problem with this, is that every single biblical reference that attaches geography to the name Yam Suf, every single one is over there by the Gulf of Aqaba. So, for example, it attaches Eloth to the Red Sea, Eloth being Elat. Mm-hmm. Well, we know, there's no question among academics where Eloth was. It's at the top, the northern tip of the Gulf of Aqaba. It references Ezion Geber. Okay, Ezion Geber means the backbone of the giant. So years ago, I worked construction in Elat, okay, so the southern Israeli city, and I would look across the Red Sea to the southern Jordanian edge and extending into Saudi Arabia, and the mountains are like a backbone. So it's as a giant's laying down. That's his spine, so to speak. And so
right.
It was referred to as Ezion Geber. Well, Ezion Geber is associated with the Yam Suf. There's not a single reference in the whole Bible that associates the Suez Canal, the western side, with the Yam Suf. Not a single one. So biblically speaking, it's really clear where it took place. Beyond that, when you actually read the account in the book of Exodus, the language there, if we believe the Bible, again, sometimes the Bible does use hyperbole. There's times when the Lord, is really emphasizing something. But when you read the account, it describes something that can only be understood as profoundly miraculous, a supernatural intervention. And the idea that the Lord just, the winds blew that night and there was just these marshes that kind of, some of the water receded and this type of thing. No, it describes the ocean being ripped in half as the evidence of God's superiority, Yahweh's superiority over the pagan gods of Egypt. That was the idea. And it was really, what's interesting is within the biblical narrative, the splitting of the Red Sea was framed as a repeat of what God did when he subdued the deep, the chaos at the beginning of creation. He divided the waters above from the waters below. He divided day from night, light from darkness, this type of thing. And he took control over the chaos. Well, he did it again when he split the Red Sea. He demonstrated his power over the ocean, over the deep. It talks about walls of water on both sides. And so,
which makes sense for drowning.
Absolutely.
Take place, yeah.
Yeah, these Pharaoh's army, these were the Green Berets. These were the Navy SEALs of the time. This was the most cutting-edge military in the world. And to think they all drowned in just a sea of reeds, it just really doesn't make sense. But if the ocean closed in on them, then it makes sense. So not only does the language of the biblical account lead us to believe that it was It was in the sea. It was in the ocean, the depths. It uses all of that language, but also just simple biblical geography says that it was over there at the Gulf of Aqaba. If that's the case, then that forces us to recognize, one, that the traditional site can't be the real Mount Sinai, and two, it has to be over there in Saudi Arabia. It's really simple. There's just a bit of some historical untangling and issues with translation and the Septuagint and all of this. But when you really look at the evidence, it's very clear that it has to be over there in Saudi Arabia.
Interesting.